we're live.
Woo!
Hello, and welcome to Time to Write Worldbuilding. This program is brought to you by Ozark Book Authority, a local nonprofit organization with the mission to improve literacy in Northwest Arkansas through fundraising, outreach, and regular literary programming. You can find more about us at www.ozarkbookauthority.com. So, Brooke is not feeling well, so I am your hostess with the mostest, and I have two very awesome authors here with me. I'll go ahead and introduce yourselves.
You can go first, Landra.
Okay, fine. Hi, my name is Landra Graf. I am a romance author located here in Northwest Arkansas, of course. I write sci-fi romance, paranormal romance, contemporary romance, all the romance, just whatever. It's whatever shoots the boat. And my newest release is The Body Collector, which is book 3 in the Bad Boys of Space series, and it is available now at all retailers.
Okay, I'm Jacquelyn Holmes. I go by Jack. That's a lot easier to say. This is my newest book. I have a shiny new copy. This is my second book in the Native Legends series. It's not available everywhere, but you can get it on Amazon.
Or from Jack. They can get it from you, though, right, Jack?
Yeah, they can get it from me. I have a website. It's jacquelynholmesbooks.com. And I spelled Jacquelyn like that.
I spelled it right.
Yeah, oh, good job. Good job. And I write young adult fantasy. And me and Landra counter each other really well because I'm not good at romance.
It's okay.
Yeah. So if you like characters that are sort of awkward about romance, my books might be for you. I don't know how that for an introduction, I guess.
That works perfect.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
So, I guess just to get started, this panel is about world building. I wanted to start by asking, both of you are world builders. What type of books do you write? Are your books set in like a secondary fantasy world like Lord of the Rings or like Narnia, or is it more like set in the present or modern world?
Jack, you want to take that one first?
Sure, I'll go first, sure. So I keep joking that my books are rural fantasy because they're set like kind of in the country, but they're urban fantasy style in that it's the real world. My books are set in Arkansas. And so the world building factors come in with like separating real, but then also here's this other stuff that's not real that makes it more fun, I think.
Mine, for my Bad Boys of Space and some of my future work, it's actually set in a futuristic setting. So this is like post present day, like kind of a what if, what could happen
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. So, but the only difference is like my current series is no aliens, it's all humans. So think more like Firefly is what I always compare it to, where you're dealing with more of humans and you have this sort of Wild West thing and kind of feel to it because you have outlaws and you have government factions and all this sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of fun with it. I think I play more fun with the technology rather than maybe the futuristic setting. Um, and it's a little different because you're not playing with as many like alien cultures and things like that, which can get more involved when you do that sort of thing. But I do have some plans to hopefully do that in the future.
Cool. So, sort of building off of that, you said that you don't play as much currently into the alien cultures. What kind of prep work did you have to do to work on this series?
So to work on the series, excuse me, to work on the series, you really have to get through like your science and kind of figuring out like how does space travel work for you. My whole thing is there's been so many different sci-fi shows. You know, I've watched A lot of them. I have a problem. Basically, anything if it's sci-fi and it's on Netflix, I've probably watched it.
Nice.
So that being said, watching all those shows and the movies and Star Trek and things like that, like you don't really want to be like, oh, we've got warp engines. So you've got to kind of come up with how does space travel work and how does it evolve and so on and so forth and how do they figure out that space travel. So you're kind of working from the past and forward, like what major events occurred to get them to space travel and then what was that technology like and what other technology is spawned from that. So it's really just figuring out that. And then once you kind of pinpointed, or once I pinpointed what I wanted to do, then it was kind of figuring out comparable terms. So my science is based off the idea of think of space like an ocean, think of ships more like ships in an ocean. And when they space travel, they travel on currents. So they glide onto a current and they can move onto a different current, almost like birds, whatnot, kind of sort of thing. So a combination of that. And then really getting into, okay, once we have that figured out, what does that look like? And then how do you, so I use a lot of nautical terminology with that and kind of blending that into it.
That's really cool. Uh, Jacquelyn, same question for you. What's some prep work that you had to do to prepare for your series?
So, my books were almost like preparing for historical fiction because I researched a lot about Native American mythology and folklore and culture, specifically the Muskogee or Creek tribe, because that's where a lot of the fantasy elements come in for my story. That it's really heavy in my books. And so I was doing a lot of like kind of like scholarly digging into what those cultures were like. And it was really hard because I have this character that starts out way in the past before Europeans came to North America, and we don't actually know very much about what their culture was like before all us white folks showed up. So a lot of it was trying to keep a consistency in the kind of mythology and folklore from that culture specifically, and how to make it because when you read myths and folk tales and stuff like that from a long ago, they're kind of weird, and they're fun because they're weird, but trying to present it in a way that contextually makes sense to your modern reader
Mm.
um, is interesting. And I have like a nice little forward at the beginning that's like, I'm sorry if I messed this up, but this was my best interpretation kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would say the majority of my prep work was really about trying to understand that culture because it's not a fictional culture like what you usually do in world building. And because of that, I think the next series I'm going to do a fictional culture because in a ways it's easier. you
It
can just
is.
you
It,
just make up what you want.
yeah, it's
So,
funner to play God.
Yeah.
uh, relating to that, I'm going to pivot back to Landra really quick because Jacquelyn mentioned that her research is um, sort of academic. She had to dig into like historical texts, and since yours is science fiction and you had to sort of work out the history of space travel, how much like science work did you do to make that space travel, or were you just more of like they can fly, deal with it?
So because my characters in the story, a lot of them are like pilots and things like that, they don't really dig too much. I don't, and because it's sci-fi romance,
Mhm.
I don't have to dig too hard into the sci-fi piece because the romance storyline is supposed to be central to the story. Versus if this was sci-fi with romantic elements, then the sci-fi element would have to be more central to the story. So
Okay.
part of it was like we're winging it, but then there was a lot of others, like there was a lot of other stuff because the whole, I mean, the science part, but then it was also researching our solar system because I was like, hey, we colonized our solar system. Boom. And I'm like, great. What's in our solar system besides these planets? Well, Jupiter has all these moons. They could have colonized those moons. And we've got an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. What is that like? And so it was really thinking through all of those things besides that. So I was spending a lot of research learning a lot more about our solar system and about space travel. And then contemplating if my idea for space travel would work, like theoretically, in a very loose possible way. And yes, in a very loose possible way, maybe. Some of it's kind of magic, like this just happened, deal with it. But some of it's like, I can kind of buy it,
I mean, they say that any
maybe.
technology that's sufficiently advanced would look like magic to us anyway, so it sounds good to me.
I could kind of buy it. I'll take it. Whatever. It works. But yeah, so it's definitely that. I will say though, to Jacquelyn's point, I did do another series that's alternate history. And that one did require doing research into what happened in history and then kind of bending it. So there was a lot. So it kind of just depends on the world you're building, really, and what genre you're doing and what you want to do, you know. And then, like I said, you're trying to find ways to make it unique as well, like
Right.
not like everything else that you see and consume.
Interesting. So, Jacquelyn, or actually, this is for both of you, but what is um, what is a particularly like compelling piece of world building that you made up in one of your books or series, and how did that influence the overall look and feel of your world?
Okay, I'll go first.
Do it,
So
Jack. Do it.
I would say that the biggest, most significant thing is that I have some characters that just don't die. Like they just don't. And like they kind of and I'm kind of going with the thinking of like they're legends rather than like regular mortal type characters.
Right.
And so there's in the first book, it's called Rabbit Trapped. There is a tradition of rabbit in the Native American folklore. A lot of the southeastern tribes, rabbit is like a trickster character, and he's all the time doing stuff to like show off and brag and make himself look way more important than he is, and he usually gets into some sort of trouble and and has to wiggle his way out of it. And in my stories, I took it to a really kind of a dark turn with that, in that he played some tricks on some people and they're really not happy about it. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing that shapes it. And some of that, like, there were some things that I had to basically make up whole cloth. Like my main character can't leave his county. That's kind of his central conflict, is that he's trapped there. Um, and that's just, I just made all that part up. But that's the central conflict of the book. So I would say it's pretty important
Yeah.
to how I ended up building everything else.
So you may have already mentioned this, and I apologize if I missed it, but did you say that your book is based on a specific Native American culture, or is it more from a few different types? Or
Yeah. So it's based in specifically Muskogee or Creek, they're also called, and in their tribe and culture and folk tales. But in researching that, I found that there is loads of overlap between their stories and some of the other Southeast American tribes, and that also the Muskogee Nation was made up of several smaller tribes. So, I mean, it's kind of like comparable to the U.S. is made up of so many states. The Muskogee Nation was made up of several smaller groups of people. Um, and so sometimes I say Native American or whatever because it's coming from different pieces of that nation. But yeah, it's featuring primarily Creek folk tales.
and did you was it just like writing and more like you said, like academic research, or did you happen to seek out anybody? Like, do you know? Did you have any contacts you could reach out to, or was it mostly just fact checking in the books?
So, so after the fact, I found some people, and if for anybody listening who goes down this path, try to find those people on the front end, and it helps you so much. um, but I found some really good sources in books and websites that I used from the very beginning. And then later, I was actually able to make contact with the cultural preservation department of the Creek Nation, and I was able to talk to them a little bit about the language and some kind of cultural norms, like just little stuff really. But the main thing that they did was they recommended me some kind of more obscure books that you would not be able to find just at your regular local library, that were incredibly helpful for me in kind of getting a bigger picture of what culturally was happening with the tribe. So
Was that
yeah,
after
that
the
that
first
was great.
book, or was that?
I found them at the end of the process of my first book. So I was in contact with them before the first book was published, but it was pretty much written at that point. Um, so there's a much stronger influence from that in the second book, because in the first book there are no modern day Creek Native Americans,
Mhm.
like tribesmen, in the book. But there are in the second book, and since this is, like I said, like a living real culture of real people, I was trying to represent them as best I could.
Right.
And that's when I started to need a lot more help,
Right.
basically.
All right. Yeah.
Since
Cool. So, Landra, same question for you. What's a significant piece of world building that helped like influence the world that you built?
that would be how they space travel. So the design of how they space travel is they convert human bones into a powder that's mixed with a liquid, and when it fuses into the engines, they can travel through space.
That is metal.
So basically, originally in the first book, it didn't really play that big of a role because it was like, cool, bone powder. So essentially, bodies, though, are worth something. Like, dead bodies are worth everything. We don't bury dead anymore. No, they become fuel to fuel ships or to fuel whatever we need to, mainly ships. Um, and then you're thinking, well, bodies then can be used for trade. Bodies can be used for what, all sorts of things. And so it actually became like a huge element to this world. And I'm working on the fourth book now, where it's a big deal because now there's this other group of people that's like, we are totally against this. We should be so intelligent and have a way to travel through space that doesn't like desecrate human bodies. And there's like a whole black market for human body parts because technically you have to strip away all the body parts. And there's like a whole illegal thing where sometimes somebody might just mess up somebody's ship so that they take them and can sell their bodies. So yeah, it got really crazy after I realized what I kind of had there.
Yeah, that's some crazy implications. I love that though.
Right, like
Yeah.
you just start spiraling outwards, and you're like, oh my gosh, these people are horrible.
That that reminds me of a fantasy series. I don't know if y'all have read any books by Cameron Hurley, but her Mirror Empire series, one of the cultures in the book, they honor their dead by eating them after they've passed, and
Lovely.
that was a like a big important thing for them. But other people that weren't from that culture would come in and they were like, "What are you doing? Why are you eating these people? That seems
Yeah.
disrespectful." And they were like, "What are you talking about? This we're eating them. That they're becoming one of us."
And that's exactly, yeah. So that whole thing kind of impacts the third book that just came out. It impacts the fourth book. It also impacts the second book. Like, there's this whole overarching plot through the first three books that kind of gets the ball rolling in book one, and then you're just like, oh, this is huge. This is awful.
So how do you, because you said that the science doesn't take the forefront, it's more about the romance because it's a romance
Hmm.
with science elements. How do you, that's such a unique and very big piece of world building. How do you balance, how do you keep that from overtaking the romance element?
So, um, kind of in this instance, it became a focus on each book, and each book focuses on a different couple, and each couple kind of folds in somehow to this overall plot involving the science. And so I focused on how each couple was impacted by this little piece of the overarching plot. And then you kind of go there. And then that's where I said that's where it kind of gets fun because we're in space, bad things can happen, blow, blowing things up, cracks in windshields.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
the engine stopped working. We don't have oxygen. I mean, there's so many options here that you can do. So you can keep things really fun and keep propelling and keep moving the plot along, even when you don't have that. And then the science just kind of folds in because naturally the science element and being out in space just really ups the danger factor by like 5,000.
that's awesome. Um, so I think you said you're both working on new works that are fantasy and science fiction. How much research or world building, either or both, do you do before you feel comfortable writing something? Is it like a
Jack?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah. So for me, on this series, it's mainly been just researching as much historical context for the culture and the tribe and their kind of belief system as I possibly can. Um, and I feel confident in saying that there's a point I think every writer gets to where you just have to start writing, whether you feel completely settled in
Mhm.
it or not.
Yeah.
and and just pray that you can get it all together in the edits, right? And
Hmm.
so for me, I kind of would research until I could feel my personal investment in the story starting to die a little bit, and then I would go, okay, I'm done researching. I can't I can't spend all of this time thinking about this. I have to just write. And I don't do a lot of plotting ahead of time. I'm
Oh, Jack.
I know me and Landra are opposites in this because I know I've talked to her before. I know she plots everything out. I am hopeless when it comes to plotting. I just write the first 20,000 words and know I'm gonna have to edit the crap out of it and then go from there. And that seems to work for me, but I don't know that I recommend it. It's more like it's almost like having like a disease. Like I just have to live with it. This is how I am, I guess. If you're like me, we're out there. It's gonna be okay. You can still be a writer. But yeah, I do a lot of research just to try to be accurate to the culture as much as I can in the front end. But at some point, I kind of go, okay, this is still a work of fiction, and this is my story, so I just need to write it. And then I do a lot of editing on the back end to try to make sure it's staying true to that. Once it's all written out.
is there anything during your research or world building that you either came up with or found that kind of altered the course of your story?
Yeah.
Something you feel comfortable talking
Yeah.
about, like
Yeah. So I would find that I would sometimes get so caught up in like trying to preserve a folk tale that my characters were sort of suffering for it. They weren't
Mhm.
strong characters. Um, and then I also found that there were times when I would really like some weird old story and it just didn't fit with the overarching story. And I would have to go back and like edit that out and figure out how to make it work with what I had. But yeah, I would say the biggest problem that I ran into was just a lack of information. And I'm gonna not get on my soapbox about this, but there is so little information about most of the Native American cultures, like the culture side of things, about even like how they ate or how they dressed or like rituals and how their communities were built pre European, whatever you want to call it, invasion, I guess. Prius. And then there was a long period where you have Europeans and Native Americans living side by side, and the only data is kind of guesstimates about population sizes or things like that, but there's not much else. So when I was kind of putting together this character that existed before that, I was making up a lot. So you talk about not feeling comfortable. Like I was like, I know, okay, we're just gonna do it and hope for the best. But yeah, I would say that the thing that caused me the most revisions was just like I would finally find a piece of information and go, oh wait, no, I probably should go back and fix this to reflect that. It's just a process that I am hoping my future book will be easier because I've already done some of that research, and the second one was definitely easier because I'd already done some of the research. That's the nice thing about a series, I guess. But the first one was all over the place. I had like 3 major revisions.
Wow. Same for you, Landra.
So I'm learning my lesson with this series. With this series, I did not plot out after books or like I plotted the first book, but then I didn't really think about 2 and 3. Like I had some loose ideas, but not like huge ideas. And then as I keep writing the books, I'm like, oh, but cool, they did this. Oh, but they should have some sort of cool tool or something when they like do this, right? Yeah, what kind of cool tool could they have? Oh, I should come up with that. So I find myself inventing more things as we go. And like in this last book, I was working away, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, hey, I have a great idea. How about I introduce synths and like android bodies and stuff? That would be cool. That's not here yet. That could totally happen. And I was like, yeah. I was like, maybe not. I don't know. This is too much. Now it's happening, and I'm like, I gotta really think this through here. So, Jack, for all I give you a hard time about, like, the pantsing, understand that I plot the story, and then I write the story, and the story kind of starts doing its own thing. And now I'm like, and this is why my editor always says, your story never looks like your outline. And I'm like,
that makes me feel better, Landra.
Outline is just a loose like interpretation of what I want to happen, and then what's really going to happen is completely different. So I have learned my lesson because the next thing I'm going to work on is a spin-off series, and I'm trying to plot all of the stuff in advance, like all the books, so I can, at least from a understanding technology wise and everything else. So I don't have surprises that pop up where I'm like, I need a cool tool. Cool, but wait a minute, why didn't they use that in book 1?
Yep. So you're saying that you plot each book, but you didn't plot the whole series, and now you're
right. Okay. So I'm stumbling across instances where I'm like, suddenly I need new technology, or like in this last book, one of the main characters is an engineer, which means he's going to know a lot more about how the engines work and how they do what they do and everything else. So I kind of have to interpret, figure all that stuff out. Because also, world building affects, like to Jacquelyn's point, she mentioned the culture and how you eat and how you do things. It also really affects your character's internal thinking, like how they reference things and how they make comparisons to stuff, and emotionally compare things or physically compare things. They're going to compare that to what their life is like. So if they're always in space and they're always that, they would describe something like, gosh, their heart was like racing, like when the engine got up to full speed or whatever, because that's what they deal with. So you have to kind of think about what are their experiences like, so then you kind of know how they emotionally describe something, I guess. It's just a really weird thing, but I try to make sure that whenever my characters are emotionally thinking through things or like making similes or metaphors,
Hmm.
it fits to the world that they actually live in and who they are. It can't be stuff from our present day world because they live in the future.
So expand on that a little bit. Is there a particular metaphor or something that you've started to use and then been like, no, that doesn't fit?
Yeah, so I think, for example, I mean, I was trying to describe somebody that was like saying, hey, this would, um, oh, they're just like a chip off the old block or something like that. Those type of phrases that we would use, those common phrases. Like, what does that mean to them? Why would they use them? Does that even make sense anymore? In their world, they don't use paper money. They use gold. And they call gold either flash or gold leaves because it comes in leaves, or they call it crinkle. So when they're referring to stuff, flash is time. Not money is time. Flash is time. If I want to make that flash, it's time. So that's what you start really thinking about is how does your common words, your common things that play into your world shape how they talk and how they think and how they act.
I like that. I like that a lot. Um,
Yeah.
so,
I would add to that actually that that's true and important no matter what genre you're writing too. Because like Landra's talking about something super futuristic and in space and all that stuff. My books are in a modern setting, but in the second book, I have a character who's kind of amnesiac. He doesn't remember a lot, so he doesn't have a lot of the same cultural references that other teenage boys have.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's constantly like, what does that mean? Like when people talk to him about stuff. But even anything you read, like your religion, your cultural norms, money, food, all of those things are going to influence your expressions, how you swear or don't
Yeah.
swear. That's a big one I see a lot. And I think that's why like Firefly classically had all this Chinese influence, and so all of the characters swore in Chinese.
hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
And if you watch the behind the scenes, they said that part of that was because it helped them be okay for TV. They didn't have to worry about it because so few audience members were going to know Mandarin
Yeah.
Chinese.
Yep.
um, so yeah, I think no matter what you're writing, you have to think about that with your metaphors and just the language of the character.
Yeah. No, completely agree.
So, whenever you're whenever you start world building, do you how do you approach your story? Do you start with a story and then start to build the world around that story, or do you start with a world and build the world and then come up with a story based on the world that you've built?
Do you want me to go first?
I mean, I love it when you go first. I'm also going to sneak away real quick and kind of turn on a light because the sun's going down and it's dark and I'm scary again.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, every story starts with kind of like a little idea, and it's usually about a character. And I think that's part of who I am as a person, and as much as who I am as a writer. My background is in like social work and stuff. My degree is in human services, so I'm thinking of things usually through like a psychology type of perspective. And so usually what interests me first is a character and what's happening with them. And so that's where I start, and I build everything outward from that. Um, and that's I also think might be part of why I'm a bit more of a pantser than a plotter, because I have to like really explore around to figure out what makes sense for that character before I really know where I'm going with the story. Um, so I usually start with the story slash character, and the world building comes after in response to that. I just bend the world to make it what I need it to be.
Playing God again.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there's lots of writers on both sides of that.
Um, I wanted originally when I thought of this story, it was it was to a call specifically where they were like, we want Firefly-esque stories. Like, okay, I like Firefly. I like sci-fi. Why not? Let's do it. Um, so then from there, it was like, okay, I'm going to create a world. And then we were like, okay, this is the world. This is the idea of for the world. And then from there, it was like, okay, I need characters to populate the world. But still, it was really loose. Like I said, it kind of just comes bits and pieces, and you start building, and you're like, okay, this is, I have these characters. Okay, this person's from here. Okay, what's here like? Whatever here is. So like in the first book, I've got a character that one of the main characters is from Earth. Well, what's Earth like now? Oh, well, Earth is like drugs and booze, and that's where all the good stuff comes from. Okay, cool. All right. And then I've got this other, girl. Okay, my female character. Oh, she's from Mars. Okay, well, what's Mars like? So then you start, like I said, you kind of go from there. You kind of start building it out. So I feel like it's an intermix of both. I really don't just start one side to the other. It's kind of like I start with this loose idea and I say, okay, if I was doing this loose idea, what would be the characters that would populate that, and how am I going to tell the story? And then it's, okay, I have these characters. Okay, well, what's their life like, and where are they from? And what's that like? And then you start, you just start kind of working backwards from there.
Mm-hmm.
But then it becomes this whole other thing. Like when you're world building, there's so much. Like you think you have it all figured out, and then you start writing and you're like, oh, there's more. But wait, there's more. And then you figure out more stuff,
Out of curiosity, because you mentioned that you had a character who's from Mars, you said you didn't explore a lot of alien cultures. Is that a human culture on Mars?
Yeah, so like the humans have colonized every planet except for like Pluto and Uranus. Because who wants to conquer Uranus? Sorry. Yeah, I know. It's a bad joke. You can
But we
laugh.
still laugh.
Yeah, you still laugh like 12-year-olds. I'm not gonna argue with it. But so they've colonized every planet. So then it's like every planet has a different type of lifestyle, though. Like everything has a different lifestyle purpose. They even colonized the moon. And so it was like figuring out, okay, well, what's this planet's purpose? Like, what do they do? So Mars, well, they terraformed Mars, but the terraforming didn't take very well, so they still have red dust everywhere. And so they're like, okay, so there's still red dust everywhere. Oh, that's where they build the ships. So Mars is the shipbuilding planet. Okay, cool. That's where they build the ships. What do they do there? So you just kind of start walking through those pieces. The thing that I didn't walk through was I didn't really dive too deeply into each planet. And then each book was kind of set on a different set of planets or moons or whatever. So then when I'd get to that point, I'd be like, what's this like? Oh. I was like, I didn't think about that. Like, I didn't think about all of the intricacies for that. So that's definitely made a difference in the future books. And I hope if any of the people who read my books are watching this, please don't be disappointed.
I mean, I definitely relate to that because I don't I don't really write fantasy, but in our role playing game, I made a rough world map for my D&D nations, and I was like, I'm gonna develop this country, and the rest of them exist, and I'll get to them later.
Yeah. But then somebody's like, but what if I encounter a person from this country?
Mm-hmm.
I don't,
Then you're like,
They wear fur. They wear fur.
I feel like this whole video is really me and Landra, how little authors have it together. How much we're just winging it.
We figured it out on the way. But we really think we're really smart when we do figure it out. We're like,
I feel like a genius. I have these moments every now where I'm like, that worked.
And I thought
I can't believe I thought that. Yes, I'm so amazing. Maybe I am doing the right thing with my life.
Yep. Yes.
So, Has there been something where, because I think both of you have said that you're writing series, has there been something that you've come up with, either in a later book or later in a book, and you realized, oops, you broke stuff earlier, and how do you like if so? We'll say a later book. If you came up with something in a later book and you were trying to figure out, for example, like Landra said, oh, why didn't they use that earlier? How do you go back and justify that past stuff since you can't change it?
My characters are teenagers and they just don't know any better.
That's smart.
They just didn't know.
Yeah, I'm doing that right now, actually. So before I was like, the moon was colonized and it's full of a bunch of stoners. Basically, super smart people that like to get stoned all the time, and they develop most of the technology that is used by everybody else, and they sell it for marijuana and other things. But then I realized these are people and they still got to eat, and the moon's not exactly like a habitable place. And they don't really live on the surface. They have like compounds that are underground and whatnot. So it's like they got to be trading for more than just drugs. I mean, there's children probably living here, families. Oops. So in the whole first book, everybody's just saying, "Oh, those stoners." Oh, a bunch of stoners on the moon and everything else. And so we get to this fourth book, and I'm like, well, they're not all stoners because the kids don't sit around smoking all day. And, you know, this isn't really nice. It's kind of a derogatory term. So I was like, so that's what it will be, a derogatory term. They don't call themselves stoners. They call themselves moonies because they live on the moon. So stoners is a derogatory term. So then I just had a character use the term and another character calls them out and says, don't call them by that derogatory name. And I was like, there, see, solved the problem.
That's smart, and it adds so many interesting layers to the existing cultures that you've already set up.
Yeah.
That's neat. Um, Same for you, Jacquelyn. Is there anything that you've been like, oops, gotta retroactively justify that?
So, I'm almost afraid to say it because people who've read my book, I'm hoping they just don't notice this a little bit, but but in the first book, yeah, I'm confessing here. In the first book, the main guy, his name is Ash. He can't leave the county, but his curse predates county lines. So, like, why would that be the limit? I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Jacquelyn, it's ley lines.
Okay, that works for me. I don't know. So
or
now
maybe it's the tribes lines.
Yeah.
Maybe the county lines magically match the tribes lines. There's a way around this, I promise you. That's the best part about world building. Where you build yourself into a corner, you can build yourself out.
Right. So in my next book, I'm working on some short stories that offer kind of backstory on some of the other characters because I just write so much backstory. I end up with a whole lot cut out and I can't just not do anything with it, right? And I'm hoping to address that in one of them where this woman who's been alive for so long will like have an offhand comment that kind of explains why those are the lines, and like maybe there's this one little section that's not actually in the county that he could have gone into because that's representative of what the actual lines were or something like that.
Oh,
I don't know.
Cool. Just, he made an assumption. That's cool.
Yeah. But one of the things I use, and I feel like this is like a total Disney move, but my characters are kind of young, and the keepers of all knowledge are not the main characters. And so there's a lot of stuff that they don't know because I didn't know. And we just pretended like this other wise character knows. And then now what I'm running into is I have to actually come up with that because I'm writing about those characters. Like they're gonna have to give up the story, right? And so that means I have to think of it. But yeah, I feel like that's like something you see a lot in like kids movies is like the main characters are really young and they just don't know, and so they go and ask like their Gandalf type character and maybe their Gandalf character is very tight-lipped. My all-knowing person just does not share a lot.
Most don't.
Yeah,
That's true.
yeah. That's a total writer ploy, man.
For I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know either. We're just gonna go with it though, and hope by the time we get to the third book, we figured it out.
I
Right?
like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is a very honest time to write talk.
I totally get it.
Again, you won't have all the answers. I can guarantee you that.
So it sounds like both of you did a lot of world building before you, or at least for your story, if not before, then during the writing and stuff. How do you pick what goes on, like on the page, and what you decide to hold back, either for future books or because it's just not relevant? How do you know what to add and what to cut in the actual story, not in the world building?
Well, Jack, I know what your answer is going to be. No.
I feel like that's like a loaded question for me. So you can go first on this one, Landra, so I can think about it for a minute.
Okay. Essentially, if it's not in the plot, I don't think it needs to be in there. So I'm a firm believer in, like, it's got to make sense for the story, and the story's the plot. So if I'm gonna mention planets or moons or other settlements or technology if it makes sense for the story. Oftentimes, a lot of times, and if people have seen some of my writing stuff before, I fast draft. So not all the details actually come out when I'm doing my first draft. It's really like just getting the words out, the basic, like kind of a framework, so to speak. And then when I go back in, I start folding things in. So oftentimes I'm really short on my first draft and I'm not where I need to be rather than super long. And so I end up adding in more words and adding in more content and adding in more world building as I go, because then I'm like, okay, oh, here they are. They're about to blow this door. I probably should describe what the heck they're using to blow this door with. That's a great idea. World building, or, oh, hey, she's talking to some dude and they're sitting there in this galley eating. What the heck are they eating? I can't just be like, they stuffed food in their faces. So, world building, so you find that that's kind of on the back end of things for me, I guess you could say. So I'm a little different in the fact that I show up short. Like I just told people, I fast drafted the book I just wrote was 52,000 words. I would like it closer to 60. It's now 58,000, and I'm almost done through the first pass of editing. So I've added 6,000 words to it.
So how much, whenever you're going back through and sort of editing, revising, how much of the stuff that you're adding in is stuff that you came up with like right then, and how much of it is stuff that you've already planned and you're like, oh, this would be a great spot for X thing?
A lot of it's stuff I've already had since this is the fourth book. Most of the technology is already developed. Like there isn't really much new outside of the idea I'm going to introduce synthetic humans. Outside of that, there's not much new technology. There's a few things, but for the most part, the food and everything else has kind of already been established. So it's really just me going in and mentioning it. In the first books, it was a lot more like, oh yeah, I need to figure out how this works, and really coming up with some fresh material and things like that.
Cool.
I'm planning not to do that with the next one. I don't want to do that again. I want to know all of it before I get into it. It's really hard too, because then you'll be editing and you'll get to a part you're like, I need to call this something. I don't know what to call this. I don't want to write XX and have to come back. Sorry, taking a 20-minute detour while I figure out what to call this.
I know that Brooke said that during the drafting of her book, she got really invested in medieval toilets and spent a lot of time looking that up.
I love this so much. Yes.
Yeah.
I love again, you will, I'll be sprinting. Sorry, Jack, I know you're getting it, but this is funny.
Okay.
I'll be sprinting with people and we'll get done with the sprint and somebody will go, yeah, sorry, I had to stop. I had to go research doorknobs. Or something ridiculously dumb like that. Like one time I was like, I don't know what you call a certain part of a glasses, like the side piece, the eye, the piece that goes over your ear. What the heck do you call that? So all of a sudden I'm like, diagram of eyeglasses. Really weird Google stuff. Anyways, okay, Jack. So what do you do? Are
Yeah.
you long? Are you short?
Um, so can I just say that my research has spawned some really weird conversations because, like, okay, so I used to have cancer. I survived all of that, but I still see an
Yay!
oncologist periodically, and I'll see her and I'm like, okay, are we done with my checkup? Yes. Can you take 5 minutes to answer this really bizarre medical question for me? And she's great about it. She's like, yeah, tell me. And like, she's always telling me. And then, like, one time I had a question specifically for an optometrist, and that guy was a little more, he was a little less into it, but he really tried to answer my question. And I didn't even mention that the character that got injured was a shapeshifter, because I was like, he already thinks I'm weird enough for bringing this up. But but he really tried to answer my question and was very nice about it. But he had the face, the like, why are we talking about this face? And you sometimes learn about things that you're like, I really hope that this obscure thing comes up tangentially in a conversation so I can tell somebody about this obscure thing that I learned about. So if you're out there and you have that weird feeling like you're not alone, we're with you. But anyways, okay, so how do I decide what to keep and what to cut? I agree with Landra in that you have to stay true to your characters and your plot and your story, and that's why people call it cutting your darlings, because sometimes you're way more invested in this little odd things than, and it's not important. It's just kind of slowing things down. Um, but I had a really unique thing with my stories in that, again, because this is a culture that still exists and it's real people, and I'm trying to be respectful of that. I was finding stuff and learning that some of the stories they didn't actually ever intend to share with anyone outside of their
Oh,
culture.
wow.
So then I had to go and decide, like, okay, can I reference this so that if somebody from that culture read this book, they would know what I was talking about, but someone who's not in that culture would just kind of gloss over it and not know? Like, how much can I touch this content and still be respectful to the wishes of these people? And then also, there was just kind of like some cultural things that's getting into some darker stuff that's kind of like, it's not fantasy, it's real for these people. And do I think it's healthy for a teenager to be researching into this dark cultural thing?
Mhm.
Because I'm
Probably
writing,
not.
yeah, probably not. So because I'm writing for young adults, and so I tried to, because I'm a mom now, and so I was trying to think, like, okay, if my daughter were a teenager, like, how much of this content would I feel like she could handle? And I have to weigh that out. And so there were some little elements and that I wanted to use in the plot that I very um, conscientiously cut, because I felt like it was the best thing to respect that culture. So that's kind of unique, but if you're going to write something about people that actually exist and it's not totally fictional, I think you have to weigh that in.
Yes.
That's a really good point too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Very interesting too.
So, how on that topic, did you run into that a lot? Of needing to pick and choose because of the culture that you were writing about. Did you run into a lot of that where you had to make that distinction, or was it just like specific things?
So it was interesting because it was not a problem at all during the first book. But like I said, I was going through a lot of super public sources. And so it wasn't an issue because these were stories that were already out there in the world. But when I finally made the contact with the cultural preservation department, and they gave me a list of books to read, a lot of them were like personal accounts of medicine men. And so some of the stuff that they were talking about, it was really fascinating, but also really sad in a lot of ways too, because a lot of them had a foreword that was basically like, our culture is we don't share this with outsiders, but I don't have anyone to take my place in our tribe, and I don't want this knowledge to die with me. And so I'm just going to write this, and hopefully a future generation in our tribe will read this. Well, I'm not that future generation looking to take up that cause. So I tried to glean as much cultural information from that. But yeah, I would say with the second book, it was a lot harder because I kind of ventured into this like I know too much territory. And trying to weigh that out was it was a much bigger factor in the second book than it was in the first book. But again, in the first book, I think another big difference was my first book, it was mostly Caucasian characters and this one really significant Native American woman who had lived pre European settlement. In the second book, the characters are interacting with current tribesmen. And so that changed a lot of just the nature of what was happening and what kind of elements you would pull in. So yeah, it was a lot in the second book. I would write stuff and kind of be like, can't do that. Nope, gotta get rid of that. Okay, let's try again. We're gonna do this instead.
How did you keep that from like blocking you creatively?
Yeah.
Sometimes I would just write it to get it out of my system, and then kind of like take that piece, put it in another file, and put it away. Because it's like there's all this backstory that I know is there that the reader doesn't really need. And honestly, all that knowledge I got really did help me make those characters more realistic. So it wasn't like a waste of time to write it out. But I think even when you come up with like a really fictional, totally fantastical setting, and you have a lot of backstory for your characters that you end up cutting, it really helps you make that character more real on the pages that you do keep. So I would say it was not drastically different than that process. But yeah, there was a couple of times where I was like, man, it would be so convenient if I could just put this little thing in there. But I knew if I started that it would derail, and that little thing would become a big thing. And I would go, okay, I'm not going to go down this path, and try to. And I went back to the more public folk tales over and over and over to try to see if there were other ways to bring whatever my desired element was into it. And so like in the second book, there's a character that she's kind of being trained up in the traditional lifestyle. And there's a lot of things, that rituals and stuff that would be happening for somebody in that position that I didn't really want to make publicly known, because that seems sort of disrespectful. So I would use, like, I would have her, like, show her talking about these folk tales that are publicly known with her grandfather who's raising her and all of that. And so that kind of still illustrated that she was learning a lot from that culture without revealing a lot of the stuff that is not meant for everybody, I guess. And tried to help. And it also was kind of a cheat in that it helped me bring back in some of those folk tales that were so important in the first book. Because in the first book, I have a character who, it's as if she was present for a lot of the original event that the folk tales are based on. So you're reading it almost like a journal entry, as if she was there and witnessed it happening. She witnessed rabbit trick alligator or whatever. And then when you read in the second book, you're hearing the story from someone who's grown up with it as a story, and it's totally fictional to them, and they're trying to figure out like the moral implication for it or whatever.
Right.
So it was a challenge, but I think it helped me. I think it actually, that limitation improved the writing in the long run. Oh, that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. That was
Good
actually great.
answer.
Yeah.
So, Landra, because your stuff is set in the future, and because is there how much, if any, of your world building did you base on existing cultures or things like that?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't really know so much existing cultures. I mean, I know that my love for sci-fi and other sci-fi shows kind of enthusiastically informed it. I think within the world itself, you have all these different factions. So you have drug runners and you have bootleggers. And so just trying to draw stuff from like, hey, 1920s bootleggers and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Each book actually was inspired by a classic gangster movie.
That's cool.
Um, yeah, so the first book is a take on Scarface.
Cool.
So, like, Scarface in space is the way I describe it. The second book is like Harlem Nights in space. And then the third book is like American Gangster in space. So there was a lot of like the first book really plays a lot more closely to Scarface and elements and things like that and ideas and stuff and the way they talk and the way they act and the whole gangster type mentality, the shows of toughness, the whole thing. So you're really playing true to kind of mentalities. And like in the second book, kind of the same way. The second book was really mainly set not in space, but on the nightclub planet Callisto. So on the moon, they've terraformed that, and it's all nightclubs. So it's where all the bad stuff is illegal or is legal there. So gambling, whoring, whatever you want to do, you can do it all here. So it was kind of fun to play with like what does that look like and what do they call those? Do they have brothels? Well, they got to call them something else. So again, you start really getting into this whole like, what do they do and this attitude and mentality, and you have to. Um, one of my friends is reading the second book right now, and she messaged me today, and she said, "This person is horrible. They're just, they are awful. This person is disgusting." And I was like, "Well, he's the bad guy. I
I mean,
mean, it's gonna be disgusting." I was like, and unfortunately, I really warred with myself on should I make my bad people redeemable or not. And I was like, this guy is not redeemable. He's not a good guy. Um, so it's kind of fun when people say that because I'm like, well, if you were disgusted by him, I hit the mark I was going for.
Yes.
But yeah, so it was a lot of like just feeding into the whole thing of the movies that I've seen, grew up watching from the gangster movies and all the sci-fi stuff. And like, what if you put a gangster in space? That'd be scary. But then it was also like, it was really fun because I got to brainstorm a lot with my husband too, who watches all the same stuff I do. Um, and we had a lot of fun with. I was like, okay, so we're in this scenario. This thing happens. This thing happens. What do you do? Well, he shoots the guy. So I'm like, okay, valid point. You're right. He'd shoot the guy. And if he's not going to shoot the guy, I got to give a reason why. So yeah, it was fun exploring that. That was kind of where I went with it. Is I took stuff from our modern world and said, what would that stuff be like if we were in the future? And what does that look like? So it was fun to play with that a lot.
that's really cool. That's awesome. Um, Jack, related to that question, we've talked about how your books are based on Native American culture, but they're also set in Arkansas. Besides the Native American culture, what what about Arkansas? How did Arkansas as a setting influence the way your story plays out?
Um, I mean, the short answer is I couldn't afford to go spend 6 months in Ireland and experience that, right? um,
Native
but
American tales set in Ireland would have been
right, it
amazing.
would have been very confusing too. But yeah, um, but I really just wanted to capture kind of small town America a little bit, and not even small town America like the people and the mom and pop stores, but more like the childhood experience of just being out in the woods and that being a big part of your life. Because even in my teenage years, I was spending a lot of times outdoors and hiking and the best thing I feel like about Arkansas is all of the, I mean, we're the natural state, right? Because it's all the trails, and we have kind of a weird diversity of terrain that can be played with, which that was helpful to my story in a lot of ways too. Like, because I have a, like, there's a scene from a cliff, there's a cave, there's a lake. You get all that in Arkansas.
This is true. It's a
So
completely true story.
yeah, and I wanted, even though I wanted it to be a modern story, I wanted it to have a certain timeless quality in that if you read this 20 years from now, it wouldn't be totally dated by technology. Trees are still going to be trees, mountains are still going to be mountains, caves are still going to be caves. And that seemed to fit really well with the Native American stuff because so much of that is tales about nature and pulling from that kind of a source. And so to me, rural Arkansas was a really great way to do that. Now, my second book is in Oklahoma, and I'm an Oklahoma girl. That's where I grew up. And Oklahoma is a place, and I don't mean this as a bash, but you kind of have to be from there to love it the way someone from there loves it. And there's like even a conversation about that in the story where one of the characters is like, I like it here. And the other person is like, nobody who's not from here likes this, you know? um, and the thing that I remember from like growing up so vividly was the hot summers in a more flat place. And so the second book is set in summertime in Oklahoma, and that's the heat almost is like a second character in some scenes. So yeah, I think part of it is it was a write what you know thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, having a lot of natural elements works with this area, and it also worked with the Native American folklore. But I honestly, when I started this story, I wasn't thinking about Native American folklore or Arkansas or any of it, actually. My original sort of germ seed idea was a gender flip Cinderella story.
Cool.
That's a really
It's
far, like,
it's really far from where it came, but I wanted it to be more like stuff that I knew and stuff that I could relate to, and not so. And I didn't want to go medieval, and I didn't want to go European castles and all that kind of stuff because we've heard it a million times, right?
yeah.
And so for me, this was a way to make it a new take on that story. But that is actually how my main character in the first book gets his name. His name is Ash because there's not really a boy version of Cinderella.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point, he's talking on walkie-talkies with someone, and his like handle is Cinderfella, and that was kind of a little homage to that because that was the original idea.
That's awesome. So I think we're coming up on time. Really quick,
Yeah.
I want one last question. Just a general, if for someone who's new to writing, or for someone who's trying their first hand at either like a sci-fi story or a fantasy story, or really any story, but what's a like one crucial tip you would give them to get started world building?
Oh gosh, there's so many.
Okay, I'm gonna go because I got one
You got
ready.
one. Go for it. I
got one ready for it. Yeah.
Know.
I would say when it comes to world building specifically is don't be afraid to get weird with it. Like if you buy into it, someone else will too. And if you are kind of like toning it down because you think it won't be like people will not be into it, you aren't as sold on it. So whatever makes you excited, no matter how weird it is, just go with it. And then if you get through your first draft and it's not working, you can always edit it. But in the beginning, be weird. Embrace the weird. Just do it, man. That's
Nike.
my advice.
Like
yeah.
Nike.
Yeah.
All right. I think my advice would be don't pants all the world building. Like, even if you're going to pants most of the story itself, don't pants on the world building. Figure out where your world came from and why it's there, and like where it developed from, and definitely figure out what you need to know for your main characters and even your secondary characters. Like, are they part of that world? Like, if they're part of Justin's main country he developed, then that's fine. But if they're part of those separate D&D countries, well, then you need to kind of know what's happening in those D&D countries. Otherwise, you can't really speak to what's going on.
Right.
So I think it's really like you can't pants world building, because when you do, like, and I think Jack would agree here.
Yeah,
From
I
a
do.
pantser perspective, when you pants, you have a lot of editing on the back end. And if you pants on the world building, that editing becomes like triple the time.
It's a new book. Is what it is. Yeah.
You're going to rewrite the book. Essentially, you're going to rewrite the whole thing if you pants on the world building. Mm-hmm. But if you don't pants on the world building, and like for my story, I can say I just had the Word doc, and I literally just wrote out the planet names. And then I wrote out a loose description of what is on each planet, or what did they do. I didn't have to have all of it, but I had to have some conscious idea of like, these are all the elements. And this is the type of ships they travel in, and this is their type of engine, and this is a loosely idea based on what that is. And so you have like your real general big world building pieces, and then you can build out from there.
All right.
And that's what I got.
I like
that. I agree with that, even as a pantser. That's why urban fantasy is kind of a cheat, because you're in the real world, and so a lot of it's already built. But if you're going to do like an epic 6-book arc high fantasy, you're going to have to plot the stink out of that.
Well, why don't y'all share with our viewers where they can find more about you, plug any books that you want to plug.
Jack.
Okay, I'll go. I'll go first. Okay.
Then you go first.
So there's my website, JacquelynHolmesBooks.com. That's the easiest way to keep up on all of it. Here's the first book, Rabbit Trapped, which you can get all of this on Amazon, or contact me on Facebook. That's another way you can get it. And then this is the second one, The Thrown Away Son, which just came out. This is still a baby. It's only a couple weeks old. And then, because this is a group of writers, I also like to pitch Persephone, because this is a pretty new literary magazine that is pretty local to Arkansas. There's some people from some other states, but it's mostly, I think, contributors from the Fort Smith area. And it's a quarterly magazine, and they don't have a ton of submissions yet. So if you're trying to get a short story or a poem published, this might be a good avenue for someone who's kind of just getting started and you're just trying to get some traction. And you can find out more about that with writersofzelda.com. They also have a Facebook page too, and I share their stuff a lot. So anyways, so that's my plug for other writers, because I feel like it's a great way to get in if you're new to the game.
That's awesome.
Okay, so I pulled up the picture. This is the Body Collector.
Can you move it?
Which, of course.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay, so there it is. That's the cover of my newest book. Yes, there's a half-naked guy on that.
Ow!
Let me remind everybody that the way the romance genre works is that typically for sci-fi romance, the common cover configuration currently is half-naked dudes. I asked for spaceships, I got half naked dudes. It's okay. That's why I really like the title of this book, because I've had lots of fun playing on words with this one, with the cover. So, yeah, I totally did one that said, "Let the bodies hit the floor." It was great. I'm having lots of fun. I'm really smart. See, I didn't know I was going to do that when I came up with the name. Uh, you can find me at laundragraph.com. I've got a newsletter. I try to send it out once a month. It happens more like once a quarter. Um, got Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, whatever. You can find me everywhere. The other thing I do too is, in earlier this year, I think some folks were part of my presentation on how to plot a romance novel in 2 weeks. I'll actually be giving the full 2 week course on savvyauthors.com, which that starts in 2 weeks. Haha, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 222. And you can sign up right now, I think, and get it like a $5 discount or something like that. It's $30. It's really fun because you get to actually plot the book over 2 weeks, and you can get feedback on your characters and your ideas and everything else. I give feedback. I'm, for the most part, pretty nice. Um, but that's a lot of fun. And again, talk about world building, whatnot. If you like talking about books, find me anywhere. I'll talk about all this stuff all day long. I'll talk about books. I'll talk about writing. I'm all down for it. But that's me.
Awesome. And we'll have links to all that in the video notes so that everyone can click all the links. So I'll just wrap up by saying that, once again, this is a presentation brought to you by the Ozark Book Authority. We're a local nonprofit organization with the mission to improve literacy in Northwest Arkansas through fundraising, outreach, and regular literary programming like this. You can find more about us at www.ozarkbookauthority.com. Thank you both very much for being here. I really appreciate you tolerating me while I stumble through Brooke's role.
You did a great job.
Yeah, you did fine. You did just fine.
Thank you.
Brooke will be very proud.
All right. Well, thank you both very much, and we'll call it a night.
Great. Thanks.
Okay.